Let's turn to Joshua chapters 23 and 24, Joshua's farewell sermon or speech. I count this the greatest single human speech in the Old Testament. And I still believe that Joseph, Joshua, and Samuel, and Jeremiah are the unsung heroes of the Old Testament. And I mean by that others may be emphasized more, like Isaiah and David and Solomon and so forth. But I believe these are the unsung heroes. Joshua did more than Moses did. Though Moses was supposed to be the leader that would take them into the promised land, he died short of it himself. Joshua took over his work and for 50 years accomplished more than ever before, ever since, for Abraham's seed. He was a great man, a valiant man, and a God-fearing man, and not the least bit shy about upholding the blessings that God had bestowed upon his people. He's 110 years of age as this book comes to a close, and he knows that his time upon the earth is ended, and he leaves behind a valiant effort and a brilliant speech that has several component parts in it. Let me just share with you what those are, and we'll see them as we read and study. His major point, of course, is the famous 24:15 statement, "Choose you this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve Jehovah." That's what he's known for. But in these two chapters, as he reviews the conquest of Canaan, he gives God the glory. And that's something true of all the great men of the Old Testament. They do not take the glory to themselves. But throughout the book of Psalms, David makes it clear that were it not for Jehovah, Israel would never have amounted to anything, and Judah would have perished before they got started. And of the 150 Psalms, I'd say 100 of them are devoted to giving God the glory. I'm talking about directly, and the others indirectly. Another point that he makes is one that Moses made in Exodus 14:14, "Our God will fight for us." And he makes it clear that they would never have amounted to anything were it not for the help of God. And we'll see that in verses 3 to 6 of the 23rd chapter of Joshua. Also, time and again, he will say, as God said to him in chapter 1, verses 7 through 10 of Joshua, be very courageous. There were many times that courage was called for. He also makes the point that Moses did in Exodus 21:3, speaking for God, that we're not to have any other gods before Jehovah. We're not to bow down to them nor serve them. Do not serve idols. Then he discusses heaven's woe pronounced upon wrong marriages. It's very much like 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 17. Be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Come out from among them, be ye separate. Then he speaks often about the goodness of God and the wrath of God that Romans 11:22 emphasizes. And he also makes the point that since God has kept his promises to you, why don't you keep yours to him? You remember the famous incident about the Rechabites in Jeremiah 35? Jeremiah will say centuries after Joshua's speech, in the same vein of Joshua's lessons, that the Rechabites honored the promise they made to their father and grandfather of never even tasting wine or even the juice of the grape, lest it be fermented, and they kept that promise all through the years. And he says, Jeremiah says to Judah, you promised God a lot of things, and have broken every one of them. Here are some men in the secular realm that kept a promise to their father, and later it'd be their grandfather, and they stuck to it, and yet you've broken the promises you made with God and wonder why you're not blessed by God. And then he mentions the plagues that were in Egypt and why they plagued the Egyptians but left God's people unscathed and untouched. He mentions the fact that they live in a land that God gave them that wasn't their own. They live in houses they didn't build. They reap the benefit of vineyards and orchards they didn't plant, and yet they need to give God the glory and quit apostatizing from their loyalty to God, since he had blessed them with everything they had. And then he closes by saying, as Leviticus 1:3, of your own voluntary will, choose you this day whom you will serve. And I believe as we read this, we'll see these points jump out of the page. Let's turn now to verse 1 of Joshua 23. And it came to pass a long time after that the Lord had given rest unto Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua waxed old and stricken in age. And Joshua called for all Israel, and for their elders, and for their heads, and for their judges, and for their officers, and said unto them, I am old and stricken in age. And ye have seen all that the Lord your God hath done unto all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he that hath fought for you. In Joshua 1:7, God said, don't turn the right hand or the left. Put your hand in my hand, and I'll bless everything you touch. And Joshua did much better than Moses by following that challenge. And as a result, a half a century, 50 years of power and conquest and glory attended Israel's way in this land of promise, a land flowing with milk and honey. He kept his physical promises of physical blessings, and also stood by them spiritually, as Exodus 14:14 says, our God will fight for us. Verse 4 of Joshua 23, behold, I have divided unto you by lot these nations that remain, to be an inheritance for your tribes from Jordan, with all the nations that I have cut off, even unto the great sea westward. And the Lord your God, he shall expel them from before you, and drive them from out of your sight, and ye shall possess their land, as the Lord your God hath promised unto you. In Genesis 15, 400 years before this, he promised that Abraham's seed would inherit this land, and even gave the periphery, the boundaries, and the names of the tribes that would live there. And he kept his promise. In Nehemiah 9:7-9, after Babylonian captivity days, he reiterated that promise made in Genesis 15 and stated in this passage too, and said, I've given you all that land. So those who think that the Jews will return to the promised land, that blessing of that promise still is intact, that's fulfilled a long time ago. And in chapter 21:43 and 24:13 of this book, he said, not one promise that I made have I failed. All the land I told you has been given to you. How premillennialists and the state of Israel can still count on the land promise when it was fulfilled a long, long time ago shows how biblically ignorant they are. There's not a single land promise given to anybody that wasn't fulfilled a long time ago. If you read Genesis 15 and learn the tribes that lived in this area, and then read Nehemiah 9:7-9, and these passages, about 4 of them in Joshua, every promise God made, all the land he promised, been given unto them, not one thing was lacking. And for the premillennialists to claim to be Bible students and pass over these clear-cut statements is very, very sad. Verse 7, that you come not among these nations, these that remain among you, neither make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause to swear by them, neither serve them, nor bow yourselves unto them. But cleave unto the Lord your God, as ye have done unto this day. He's going to make a statement at the end of 24 that as long as you do these things, you'll prosper. But the moment you turn away to serve other nations or the idols of other nations, you'll go again into captivity. So he becomes a prophet that predicts Babylonian captivity. They've been delivered from Egyptian bondage into the land of promise. They've received all the land and all the promises. And he's simply saying, and when you forget the source of these is God, you'll go again into bondage, into captivity. So he becomes a historian, a prophet, and a few other things, except beyond being a statesman and a mediator. For the Lord hath driven out from before you great nations, verse 9, and strong, but as for you, no man hath been able to stand before you unto this day. One man of you shall chase 1,000. For the Lord your God, he it is that fighteth for you, as he hath promised you. Christians are told in Hebrews 13:5-6, he'll never leave us nor forsake us, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear what man shall do unto me. See, we have even exceedingly precious promises beyond these that deal with a heavenly land. And should we miss it, it won't be God's fault. His Son went to prepare a place for us there. Take good heed, therefore, unto yourselves, that you love the Lord your God. Else, if you do in any wise, go back and cleave unto the remnant of these nations, even these that remain among you, and shall make marriages with them. Now he talks about wrong marriages, an intermarriage between God's people and the heathen. You might remember in Ezra, chapters 9 and 10, the last two chapters of Ezra, they had to put away these strange wives, these foreign marriages had to be changed. And we ought to learn a lesson from that. And shall make marriages with them, and go in unto them, and they to you. Verse 13, that for a certainty the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps unto you, and scourges in your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God hath given you. You might remember in Deuteronomy chapter 19, God said you now have 3 cities of refuge where you can go to appeal for your life, to offset the blood covenant of Genesis 9. And he said, when you get into the promised land, to prove you're there, add 3 more cities of refuge to show that God hath given you all the land he promised to give you. That's Deuteronomy 19. In Joshua chapter 20, they add those 3 new cities of refuge, which makes 6 in all. And that proves that all the land promise God had given to Abraham's seed had been fulfilled. The very fact they add 3 more cities, in view of what Deuteronomy 19 says, proves in Joshua 20 they had all the land that God had ever promised them. And when premillennialists speak of 6 cities of refuge, they cut their own throat spiritually. Wouldn't be 6 until they had all the land he had promised them. Here in 23:14, notice, and behold, this day I am going away of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one thing hath failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spake concerning you. All are come to pass unto you, not one thing hath failed thereof. Now where is the gall of the premillennial teacher that says Israel is going back to their land? And then our government and the coffers thereof support people who are in error from the get-go on that subject, and leave the impression that is their land and it's God ordained, and that premillennialism will prove that when he comes back he'll give them all those promises. The very opposite of what the Bible teaches. So if God made a promise, and he did in Genesis 15, and he kept every promise he made to them, then the whole hoax of premillennialism goes up in smoke. There is no land more holy than any other land. And for brethren to speak of taking trips to the Holy Land plays into the hands of teachers of error. You might say ancient Bible lands, but there is no scrap of land on earth more holy than any other. God does not dwell in temples made with hands, Acts 7:48-50. And we need to appreciate that, and that's what he's saying in this speech. This farewell speech of his not only buoys the confidence of the people to whom he speaks and challenges them to a righteous life, but it disproves, by anticipation, religious error that wasn't taught for years and years. All right, let's read verse 14. And behold, this day I am going away of all the earth. And you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one thing hath failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spake concerning you. All are come to pass unto you, and not one thing hath failed thereof. Therefore, it shall come to pass that as all good things are come upon you, which the Lord your God promised you, so shall the Lord bring upon you all evil things, until he have destroyed you from off this good land which the Lord your God hath given you. Romans 11:22. Mitt, read that for us. Romans 11:22 would be a great commentary on everything we've read and studied so far in this farewell address. This is where Paul says, behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. And he's discussing there how that the Jews have no special privilege over the Gentiles. God is no respecter of persons. There's no distinction between the Jew and the Greek. Now let's notice the wording of Romans 11:22 as it blends with what we've just read.
Behold then the kindness and severity of God, those who fell, severity for you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness, otherwise you also will be cut off.
Behold the goodness and severity of God. That's what he's discussing right here. The blessings God has given to us in his goodness, and the curse upon them if they turn away, and they have only themselves to blame. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God on them that fell severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. We are creatures of choice. He had blessed them abundantly. I'm going to say one more time what I've said a few times before, not in this context. But if you want to read the classic passage in the Old Testament, I'd even say in the Bible, on God's goodness and man's rejection of it, and man's rebellion toward it, and the subsequent non-blessings that come upon him. It's Psalm 78. There are two major historical psalms that sum up in review the Old Testament, and God's dealing with his people, and they're dealing with him. Psalm 78 and Psalm 106. And you'll never read a better summary, overview of the Old Testament and God's dealings with people and how they rejected his goodness and loving kindness. And about the time he blessed them, they cursed him. And so he's simply saying, here's everything God promised. He did it. Now you're going to receive it and be grateful for it, or turn your back upon him and be ushered out of the promised land. Verse 16, when you have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods and bowed yourselves to them. In fact, in Psalm 78:41, he said, you hindered what the righteous God of heaven will like to do for you. You've limited the Holy One of Israel. Psalm 78:41. He wants to give you blessings and you limit them. And served other gods and bowed yourself to them. Then shall the anger of the Lord, therefore it's not wrong to be angry. God said, I'm angry with the wicked every day. Psalm 7:11. All my life I've heard preachers real quick say, oh, he loved the sinner but hated the sin. That's not what the Bible said. It says God is angry with the wicked every day. He didn't say God is angry with their wickedness, but he's not angry with them, because people commit sin. Sin doesn't run down the road by itself. It's always attached to somebody. And so the point is, it upsets God. It breaks his heart. What does Genesis 6 say? As the flood was about to come, it grieved God that he had made man. And the Bible tells Christians to be angry and sin not. In fact, we need some righteous indignation, like Jesus showed when he ran the money changers out of the temple. And when Paul's spirit stirred within him when he saw the idolatry of Athens, Acts 17:16. There's no way you can get around his spirit stirred within him without saying he was angry over idolatry. And he exposed it. Our problem is we don't have any righteous indignation. We see denominationalism, Catholicism, Mohammedanism, and on it goes. And if we're not careful in the recent publicity and so forth, we're going to get to thinking the Muslim religion is all right. We're not talking now about individual people. We're talking about the system itself, and every time you sit down and study it, they can say it's a religion of peace, but it won't hold up in world history. I'm not talking about individuals. I'm talking about a system and how it began and who began it and what it was notorious for years. So we ought to be angry over sin, over denominationalism, over error. We shouldn't sit and listen to denominational preachers pervert the plan of salvation and say, he's a good guy, though. He's a good fellow. One more time, if you were counterfeiting money, what'd be the most dangerous counterfeit money? The more accurate to the real thing. The nearer to truth error is, the more appealing it is, and the more deceiving it is. One of the most dangerous things in the world is a false teacher who grins a lot. We need to really stop and think about this matter of counterfeit religion. I wonder how many of these people say, well, Canaan's a pretty good place to live, and these people we used to call heathen are pretty good neighbors. And we've really profited here in this land, not giving God the credit for it, you know. And pretty soon you're at ease in Zion, Amos chapter 6. You're just sitting down by evil and error and thinking it's a pretty good thing. One of our biggest problems is we cannot be angry over sin. Doesn't mean that we retaliate in unkindness, but in firmness for truth. When Jesus said, in essence, just a little bit of error mixed with truth is error. You can't mix a little poison with good food and it not be poisonous to eat. Jesus said no man can serve two masters. You'll hate the one, love the other, hold the one, despise the other. If you're not for me, you're against me. Matthew 6:24, Matthew 12:30. One of our biggest problems today is Isaiah 30 verse 10 comes into play. Speak to us smooth things. We want things to be smooth and appealing, and talk about love and grace and mercy, and never truth and error and right and wrong and heaven and hell and God and Satan, like the Bible does. Revelation 12:9-11 proves just what I've said. and you bowed yourself to them, then shall the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and ye shall perish quickly from off the good land which he hath given unto you. Ned, read 2 Chronicles 7:14, which is the balanced verse of the entire Old Testament, where God charges and challenges his people on what they must do if they would be blessed by him. 2 Chronicles 7:14. I believe it's the key verse in the entire Old Testament.
If my people who are called in my name humble themselves, pray and seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, and I will hear from heaven, and will forgive their sin and heal their land.
Notice the contingency, if. He didn't say, I'll bless you anyway. If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked way, then, adverb of time, then, when they do this, then I will bless them. 2 Chronicles 26:5 says, as long as Uzziah sought the Lord, God made him to prosper. 2 Chronicles 13:12, O Israel, fight not against the Lord God of your fathers, for ye shall not prosper. Those are very exacting, challenging, demanding words. So Joshua's building up to verse 15 of 24. If it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods are on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve Jehovah. Very definite. And the whole first psalm speaks of how blessed the man is who walks in the counsel of God, who doesn't sit down with the scornful, but sticks with the Lord, and his fruit will be productive and beneficial. But the ungodly are not so. They're like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. We don't have enough definite soul-searching teaching and preaching. And one reason is we don't read the text of the Bible, which brings down on just about every page. You can't even read very long in the Psalms of what sin and righteousness are contrasted, like that first psalm. God is angry with the wicked every day, Psalm 7:11. Jesus looked on them with anger, Mark chapter 3 says, and you can look that word up in the Greek text, and the word anger isn't watered down. I've heard people read that and say, that doesn't mean what we say back. No, it's just double tough anger. It's deeper. It's more provoked anger. And what did he do? He ran the money changers out of the temple. He read the right act to the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, the religious elite. So what we've just read in 23 is a prelude to how he wraps it up in 24. I do believe we have a lot of brethren today who've been sold the Dale Carnegie work on how to win friends and influence people. We ought to try to win friends for Christ and expose error so our friends can be saved. Paul said, if I were yet pleasing men, I should not be the servant of Christ. Galatians 1:10. He said, am I your enemy because I tell you the truth? Galatians 4:16. James 4:4 said, if you make yourself a friend of the world, you're yet making yourself an enemy of God. In other words, we are here to please God, and then all righteous, proper thinking people will love God too and love us for showing them how to love God. We're not in a gigantic popularity contest. We don't see how many people we can alienate before lunch. But we're going to not have a whole lot of people stand in line to pat us on the back when we preach the whole counsel of God. It just won't happen. And we might as well get used to that. But I'd rather good men, sincere men who are converted by truth would appreciate me than for the whole world to vote me most popular man in town. I've never gotten a plaque from the Junior Chamber of Commerce saying I was the best citizen in town, and I don't expect to. Chapter 24, verse 1, and Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elders of Israel. I want to pause on that word elders. I've been asked many times, how could they appoint elders so quickly in the first century? Just go through an area, establish congregations, and come back through pretty soon and appoint men to be elders? Well, one reason is they had elders in Israel that had to meet many of the qualifications that elders in the church do. Over and over in the Old Testament and the New, you'll read of elders among the Jews, among the Israelites, among the Hebrews. And they had to have high qualifications to fulfill that role in the Hebrew religion. So a lot of the family requirements, and also something we often forget, God ordained Judaism. That wasn't a denomination. That was the religion of heaven until supplanted, replaced, and superseded by Christianity. So some of the very principles of leadership in Old Testament days were still true to people in the New Testament economy or the New Testament church.
Do they have elders today? I have never heard of elders.
I don't know. I don't know. So many religious groups don't have elders, and when you show them the New Testament references, I even helped a Pentecostal group to, in a debate I had with them, to start having elders. They didn't function like the New Testament elders, but somebody they called elders, you know. They wouldn't have known them if they'd hugged them around the neck in the middle of the street. But the point I'm making is that in Judaism, I don't want to check on that. In Judaism, they may not call them that, that's what I'm trying to say. They probably have someone functioning like that. But it's an interesting thing that sometimes when we read over a passage, if we don't draw that out, we overlook that. And for their heads and their judges and for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Your fathers dwell on the other side of the flood in old times, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nachor, and they served other gods. And I took your father Abraham from the other side of the flood, read Genesis 12, and led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his seed, and gave him Isaac. And I gave unto Isaac Jacob and Esau. I gave unto Esau Mount Seir, and in the book of Obadiah, the one-chapter book, that's where the descendants of Esau were, in a place called Edom at that time, near Mount Seir. In fact, that's mentioned in the little one-chapter book of Obadiah. To possess it, but Jacob and his children went down into Egypt. And I sent Moses also and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt. Notice how this is worded. I blessed you, I plagued them. The captors of God's people, Abraham's seed, were plagued, and my people, I delivered them. According to that which I did among them, and afterward I brought you out. And I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came unto the sea, and the Egyptians pursued after your fathers with chariots and horsemen unto the Red Sea. Read Exodus chapters 12, 13, and 14. And when they cried unto the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and brought the sea upon them, and covered them, and your eyes have seen what I have done in Egypt, and ye dwell in the wilderness a long season. You dwelt in the wilderness. So he's reviewing the blessings he had poured out and the protection he had given them against their enemies. In essence, he's saying, why wouldn't you want to serve Jehovah all the days of your life with all your heart? Everything you have, he gave to you. This land, the houses, the vineyards, the orchards, blessings on top of blessings. Why would you even consider not serving me? But you remember back then, some of the people said, let's make us a captain to lead us back to Egypt. Numbers 14:4. Then they made a god that they had learned to worship and bow down to in Egypt, a golden calf. It's an amazing thing how God had any patience with them at all. They limited the Holy One of Israel. So he's reviewing this. And brought the sea upon them, covered them, and your eyes have seen what I have done in Egypt, and you dwelt in the wilderness a long season. And this is where he gave them manna from heaven and water from the rocks. And then when they complained they didn't have any meat, he gave them quails in such abundance they said, take them away. Kind of hard to please some people. And I brought you into the land of the Amorites, which dwelt on the other side of the Jordan, and they fought with you, and I gave them into your hand, that you might possess your land, and I destroyed them from before you. You remember in Judges chapter 7, verse 2, he said, I've reduced your army, and we know it's to 300, to fight against 135,000 Midianites, so that when, not if, but when the battle is won, you'll never say by our own power and our own might we've done it. Judges 7, verse 2. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and warred against Israel, and sent and called Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. This is Numbers, chapters 22 through 30. But I would not hearken to Balaam, therefore he blessed you still, so I delivered you out of his hand. And ye went over Jordan and came unto Jericho, and the men of Jericho fought against you, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and I delivered them in your hand. And these are the very territories God mentioned as the boundaries of the promised land back in Genesis 15. Now, when they come into Canaan, that's been fulfilled. Then later, when they're restored to the land after Babylonian captivity, he uses these same designations, the people that surrounded the people of God in Canaan. And I sent the hornet before you, which drave them out from before you, even the two kings of the Amorites, but not with thy sword, nor with thy bow. In other words, I fought for you. Our God will fight for us. Exodus 14:14. And I have given you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you built not, and you dwell in them. Of the vineyards and olive yards which you planted not do you eat. Now therefore, and every good sermon has a therefore. That simply means what is preceded and that which follows are irrevocably linked together. Therefore. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth. This idea of God didn't demand sincerity. It was just an external outward religion in Old Testament days, and the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament. Won't work. It just won't work. Micah 6:8 alone proves that. He has showed thee, O man, what is good. What doth the Lord require of thee? But to do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with thy God. That's what he required of people who would please him in Old Testament days. And today we're to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Matthew 22:37-40. God's always demanded the same thing, sincerity and truth. There's not a God of the Old Testament, a God of the New. He is the same God. He changes not. Malachi 3:8. Hebrews 13:8. The same yesterday, today, and forever. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. Ecclesiastes 12:13-14. And put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood, and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, see, we are creatures of choice. He didn't say, I demand this and you have to do it. Salute me and go on. No. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods that your fathers served on the other side of the flood or the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land did dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. What a distinction between him and many others. And the people answered and said, God forbid that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. And Joshua hadn't been dead very long till in the terribly weak period of the judges, they turned their back upon God. They violated every one of these statements. People answered and said, God forbid that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God, he it is that brought us up and our fathers out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, and which did those great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way wherein we went, and among all the people through whom we passed. And the Lord drave out from before us all the people, even the Amorites, which dwelt in the land. Therefore will we also serve the Lord, for he is our God. When the Ten Commandments were given, the first statement, thou shalt have no other gods before me. I, Jehovah thy God, am a jealous God. Over in 2 Corinthians 11:2, Paul said, I'm jealous over you with a godly jealousy. I've espoused you as a pure virgin unto Christ. God will not tolerate impurity. And Joshua said unto the people, you cannot serve the Lord, for he is an holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgression nor your sins. Or you can't live in the way, you can't boast with your lips something you don't back up with your life. If you forsake the Lord and serve strange gods, then he will turn and do you hurt and consume you after they have done you good. And you do need to read Psalm 78 and Psalm 106 tonight or early tomorrow to get it in your mind. And the people said unto Joshua, nay, but we will serve the Lord. And Joshua said unto the people, ye are witnesses against yourself, that you have chosen you the Lord to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. Now therefore put away, said he, the strange gods which are among you, and incline your heart unto the Lord God of Israel. And the people said unto Joshua, the Lord our God will we serve, and his voice will we obey. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and set them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and took a great stone and set it there under an oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said unto all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness unto us, as a witness unto us, for it hath heard all the words of the Lord which he spake unto us. It shall be therefore a witness unto you, lest you deny your God. So Joshua let the people depart, every man unto his inheritance. You remember in the lifetime of Christ, he said, even the stones will speak. Perhaps that's what he's talking about. This has been documented in heaven with the promise of my people, and the very stones will cry out. And it came to pass after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of the inheritance in Timnath-serah, which is in Mount Ephraim on the north side of the hill of Gaash. And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, which had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel. Now this is interesting. And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt. Read the last 2 chapters of the book of Genesis. Don't bury me in this heathen land. You take my bones with you to the promised land and put them down in the promised land. He had more faith in dying than some of them had in living, but I love this conclusion, hundreds of years. And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the son of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and it became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. And Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him in the hill that pertained to Phinehas, his son, which was given him in Mount Ephraim. I love that section of Scripture, the last 2 chapters of Joshua. I think we can even envision what a great man he was by the speech he made. And the whole theme was, to God be the glory. The debt of gratitude we owe him. We need to appreciate that we're servants of the one who guided us, sustained us, blessed us, and helped us live until this moment. What a great man Joshua was. He outdid Moses in every way you can think of. And that's why I think he's one of the main unsung heroes. Notice the very first verse of the book of Judges on the next page. Now after the death of Joshua it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first to fight against them? So the point is, Joshua, when Moses died, Moses, my servant, is dead, ending Deuteronomy and beginning Joshua. Someone as great, if not greater than he, arose. But it's going to be several centuries before anybody like Joshua will come, and his name will be Samuel. And in between, you've got 15 judges, and like a spiritual accordion, the people rose to the heights when the judge was appointed. When he died, down to the dregs of sin. Here came another one, and just like a spiritual accordion, yo-yo up and down. So they didn't have anybody similar to Joshua or Moses until Samuel came. And when the people said, give us a king that we may be like the nations round about us, he fell on his ground in sorrow, praying. God said, don't hit the ground, stand up. They haven't rejected you, they rejected me. That's what happens when you have 15 periods of Bible history where it's just down, down, down. So we need to be constant and steady. If he's the same yesterday, today, and forever, we need to be that with truth and never vary from it or vacillate from it. And the next time that I'm with you, which will be about 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to take the greatest sermon ever preached, Christ on the cross.